Hello, and thank you for listening to Critical Thinking is Required. Today we're about to discuss For a New Liberty, and this is part 6, the final and last part of our literature series 1, which is discussing For a New Liberty by Murray Rothbard. And today we'll be covering chapters 13 through the epilogue, and so we'll see how long it'll take. But he brings the epilogue. It was interesting because the epilogue at first I wasn't going to talk about, but I found it really interesting and thought-provoking for numerous topics that we will discuss. Just to remind everyone, this was written in 1973. So let's continue. And if you haven't seen the other parts, make sure you check out criticalthinkingisrequired.com, click on Literature Series, and then click on For a New Liberty, and you can watch them all. Okay, so chapter 13, Murray Rothbard discussed conservation, ecology, and growth. So dealing often with environmentalism as well. So he talks about liberal complaints. So one of the things that we've had is that, the progressives or liberals or whatever, socialists, whoever would support the state throughout history, they've complained. And it was especially, this book was written in 73, so he's pointing to numerous books that were written at the time that made these complaints about the society. So basically, there's just too many poor people. We have to do something. We need to intervene and do something to help these people. And this is interesting because I never looked at the dates that these books were written, because I've read both the Affluent Society, which he discusses, and The Other America, which Affluent Society was written in 1958, and The Other America was written in 1962. And both of those books discuss problems of poverty, right? And so what's interesting to me about that is that, this is after the Great Depression, and this was after, FDR coming in and basically increasing government to beyond its wildest dreams at that point, and they still had problems. Like, that's the key. There were still problems. And so, of course, in 1963 and 1964, they declared the war on poverty. LBJ declared the war on poverty, and then, so now they're attacking it again. So when I did an episode, which you can check out on criticalthinkingisrequired.com, about the war on poverty, again, it's the same sort of thing where you can make these complaints today. Liberals make the complaints today where we're still poor. Well, government's getting more involved, so maybe there's a correlation there. But, there's still a war on poverty, and it has been, and it definitely was at the time that the book was written. And so then he talks about conservation of resources. So I don't know why he specifically brought the liberal complaints in at first, but so he talks about resources, and I think what he's doing here, he's trying to say how the private market can conserve resources and produce items the most efficient way, and they can do it better than government can. And so one of the things he's looking at, you could look at dozens, hundreds, thousands of items, right? And so copper. So he's looking at the item of copper. And the question is, why hasn't it been exhausted? Why is there still copper? Copper has been used for centuries, for probably millenniums. I have no idea, but it's been used for a long time, let's just say. And it's still here. Like, it's magic. I guess it's a similar argument to trees or to water or to certain things. It's like, we still have it. And if the miners, and I think he's getting back to greediness here, if the miners are really truly greedy, wouldn't they just mine all the copper? Wouldn't they just go to a mine, take all of the copper, and then just sell it all, and then make huge bucks? And then they could turn it around and make even more in the stock market or something, right? They can invest. And why don't they do that? Instead, what they do is they conserve the copper mine. So they're protecting the environment here, which is interesting. It's an interesting way to look at it because you don't really think of these people as protecting. We need the item, okay? Everyone's going to admit that we need copper, for our phone lines or for internet or whatever we use it for, phones, whatever. We need copper, just like we need a lot of these rare natural resources that we may have to destroy parts of Earth. So then you have to think, well, if we have to, then what's the best way to do it? And what the private market here is doing is they're conserving, and that's the best way for the environment and for people generally, because they want to conserve the copper mine, they want to add to it, they want to make it better, they want to take it out slowly, not all at one time, because they want revenue in the future. It's not all about just immediate return, where it is for some businesses and it is for a lot of individuals too. But most people and most businesses most businesses are looking for the future because they want to survive beyond just 1 year. And so they want that revenue. And so, let's say there was an expected shortage where they sent, there's an increased demand. We kind of are noticing it every month or every week or something. So we expect the next 6 months that there's going to be a shortage. Right? We just don't have enough. Well, what they're going to do is they might withhold some more copper, right? And you could apply this to gas too. This is, to understand why prices would go up or down. If they're withholding the copper now so they can save it for future production. So what you're going to have is you're going to have increased prices, but slight. And then in the future, in those 6 months or whatever, where the shortage is expected, they would remain low. So if they didn't do that, then people would not have access to the copper because there'd be this increased demand, and then it would be super high. The cost would be increased a whole lot more. And so, the prices will increase. And then the other thing that does when the price increases even before the shortage is that it acts as a signal to the consumer. And so what they might do, and what they will do, is they'll use less and they'll conserve, unless they can afford it. But generally, the mass of people aren't going to be able to pay these increased costs. They're going to maybe go, like gas prices. If gases went up, they're going to go, maybe I shouldn't be driving as much. Maybe I'll conserve. Maybe I'll drive with someone else. Maybe I don't need to go to the shopping center today. Maybe I can just do it once a week instead of 3 or 4 days every week. And what else will happen is the businesses themselves, they're going to try to substitute cheaper metals or plastics. And so what they're going to do is they're going to innovate. They're going to have technological advances to try to find a way around having to use copper or gas or something. They're going to try to figure something out. And it might be shorter or longer. I don't know how long it's going to take. But maybe not even a whole new product. Maybe it'll just be a new way to refine it, a new way to make the item more efficient. And so, again, the development of cheap substitutes has kept natural resources cheap and abundant. And so what we have here is we have a way where the private market acts on itself without government intervention, magically, to conserve and protect the environment. Because, of course, we're assuming that we have to extract these items for our use. Because even in a socialist government, you'd still have to do that. Even to build solar panels, you're required to have certain natural resources in order to make it, right? And so there's going to be destruction of the planet. And so we're going to talk about government ownership of resources. So the private property is only in the use of the resource and not the resource itself. So when the government owns, let's say, a mine, let's say they own a mountain and they own all the gold within it, or trees or something, and they provide a license or something to a business that can come in and they can chop the trees down or mine the mine. Well, what happens then is that the private, no one owns it privately. That property is still government owned. And so someone else is coming in and sort of renting it out. But they don't really have any property rights in the use of the resources, right? Just within the contract. So they don't, what I'm trying to say is the user doesn't own the capital value. They don't own it. So they don't have to worry about it. They don't have to worry about that if they were to just mine it all and take it all right now, that it's not going to be there next year because they're just paying a license fee. They're paying for the year, let's say. Well, guess what? If you're paying for something for a year, you're probably going to take advantage. Imagine if you were getting Netflix, let's say, and let's say you knew, because it was too expensive, that you knew you were only going to pay for 1 month or 30 days, right? And so what you do is you watch all the movies you can within that 30 days, right? It's the same idea. Same if... I don't know, like if you were on the Kindle thing or like Liberty Me or something where you have access to all those books, maybe what you would do if you had it for just 1 month is you download all the books and just read them, and then you didn't care any time after that, right? That just makes sense, right? Because you don't have a private property into the right of those books or the movies on Netflix or whatever. And so there's also no economic incentive to conserve or innovate. They don't have to do that. And so the only incentive is to use as much as possible. So it's not just that there's no economic incentive, but any incentive that is inherent is that you're going to use as much as possible because you're trying to make money, right? And I don't think that's how everyone's going to act. So then he talks about pollution. And so, of course, we can look at the past 100, 200 years, but specifically maybe even within the past 60 years or so, or maybe when the EPA was around. But the government ownership of all this stuff, of rivers and waterways and all this stuff, it's proved to not be a solution. It hasn't worked. Just like we talked about with all this stuff, with police and everything. Yeah, it's worked to a degree, but it hasn't eradicated these problems, which is why why they do these things to begin with, right? So why government has to regulate pollution is because it's not to make things it's to fix it. It's to end pollution. And clearly that hasn't worked. And the most polluted areas are the areas where the government has the most control over. So you can think of the air, right? We talked about this, well, I guess I'll wait a little bit. And then waterways, rivers, oceans. Ocean is something that someone can't own privately. So where's the incentive to treat it with respect? And you can apply this same type of logic to, let's say, whaling. When you hear about whales dying left and right and how they could be extinct, well, that's because one of the reasons is because there's no incentive, because there's no private property right in the whales. You just go out there and whale. And because you're not allowed. The government they forbid you from, let's say, creating a net or something in the water, or maybe tagging them or something so that you can track them, so you know how many you can basically sell, right? And so the government has no economic incentive to preserve the purity and value of air in the waterways. So an example that Murray talks about is, let's say a private firm owned Lake Michigan. So I don't know how this would work, but let's just say they own the whole lake. And so what would happen if someone came in the lake and dumped pollutants? We see that, I think it was like Duke Energy in North Carolina, right? That was a public waterway. But what happens when it's a private waterway? We know absolutely, without a doubt, that what's going to happen is once that person, the owner, finds out, they're going to sue the other people. Okay, that's what's going to happen. And that's how you would protect that type of danger to the lake, because they don't want the damage to the lake, unless they use the lake to just put pollutants in. But they're not going to make as much money as they would doing other things with it, especially with water problems that we have throughout the nation. And so then you'd ask, but with the Duke Energy thing, because it's public, the only really true solution is to wait for the government to actually do something. And you would have to hope that the government and the corporation don't have some sort of relationship like they actually did in that situation. And you'd have to hope that they actually sue and win, right? And so the other thing is that when you're talking about pollution and you're talking about, think about it, like when you turn on the news and it's like these businesses and corporate, the oil giants, right? They're these pollutants, right? The coal plants and all this stuff, like they're the main polluters. Like they're the people who we need to control because they cannot control themselves. Well, they're not in fact the main polluter. The single major active polluter today, and at the time that he wrote his book in 1973, is the state. The state is by far the main aggressor. Now, he talked about the DDT sprays over fields. That was problematic with malaria and stuff back then. Atomic Energy Commission and radioactive waste. So that's the government in charge of, the nuclear testings and all that stuff they did for the war and all that stuff. Because that's all government doing that stuff. It's not private businesses. Or at a minimum, it's them working together. But during the war, that was them. That was the state basically bombing. What type of pollution does that cause? And why is there's no one fighting for that? Because no one has private property to that land, right? It's public, so they can just bomb it all they want. And nobody owns the air above them, so the people who are damaged nearby can't sue either. They have to wait for the state to do it. Well, the state's not going to sue the state. And then you have the municipal monopoly of utilities. And we've talked about this before, where because of the monopoly, that there's no competition, there's no price mechanism, there's no way to innovate, there's no way to create better stuff and to use it efficiently. There's no price mechanism to conserve and all that stuff that we talked about today too. And so all these things, these add to pollution. And now I would add, one of my biggest things is urban sprawl. It's the highway system we have. By far, that is definitely, I don't know why you didn't say that, but that's by far the most, that has to be more pollution from that than all these power plants and stuff. Because there's millions of people on the car roadways and millions of emissions that are coming out. And then there's countless other, there's just too many things to name. But they're the main aggressor. Nobody even complains about them, right? So then air. So now we talk about air specifically. Well, he gives some things, and we talked about this in our public nuisance episode that we had a few months ago. And I talked about private and public nuisance, so you can learn a little bit more about that. I would go more in depth in that episode. But the bottom line is he gave this solution, which was really interesting, which is that you would own basically the property that you on your land, and then you would also own the property above you, pretty much forever, right? Until you get to the atmosphere, outer atmosphere type thing. And so basically what would happen is that if there was air pollution that came into your property and you didn't want it, you didn't consent to it would be a violation of non-aggression principle, and there would be nuisance law or something like that, and that would punish. You could then sue whoever is polluting your land or your air above you, and you could find damages for it. And you could stop it, which is more important, right? You could have an injunction or something saying they can no longer do that because it's going to continually to invade in your land. And another thing, he's talking about airlines and how, right now just planes can just willy-nilly go above us and we have no right to that air. Well, what they could do is the airplanes, the company and the airlines, they could they could give you money and say, we're going to fly our airplane over because of the way the clouds and the wind cycle and all that stuff is, we just have to go through your land. So we're going to pay you, I don't know, $1,000 a month. How's that? Well, that's awesome. But now nobody gets that. So think of that as actually a subsidy for corporations. And what that does is it acts as a way to support more pollution. Because maybe they wouldn't fly as much if they only had to go in certain channels, or they'd make it more efficient. There's a lot of things. Noise is something else because that's in the air. It travels through the air, so if it invaded your property, it'd be a violation of the non-aggression principle, and it would subject to a claim of nuisance law. And if air pollution is allowed to proceed with impunity, so if we just say it's okay to have air pollution, well, there's no economic incentive to develop a technology that will not pollute. So if we think about cars, if what you're causing, if they're causing smoke to go and it continues to go in your air and invades your property, well, there's no incentive if they're allowed to continue to do that to change the way the car uses air or uses pollutants and how it gets rid of it, how it excludes it. There's no way to change that. There's no incentive. Of course, it could be changed, but it's not the most efficient way. And the government can always say this is the way to do it, but we don't know if that's truly the most efficient way. And it likely isn't because, again, there's no price mechanism. They're just pulling it out of their butt. Probably, again, because they have a relationship with business, so they're going to support something that some contributor or something wants. So chapter 14 is war and foreign policy. So at first he defines isolationism, and what that is it's opposition to war and political intervention between countries. Okay, and what he would say instead of going to war and intervening countless times, what we should do instead is have peaceful freedom of trade, investment, and interchange between citizens of all countries. If everyone could just trade, we'd be okay, basically is what he's saying, generally. And it was interesting because I just watched a video today with China, and they were complaining about basically there's planes, the United States are sending surveillance planes into China to, basically surveil the country. And China's like, well, hey, why are you doing that? Why can't we just be business partners? This is a rough estimate of the quote. Why can't we just be business partners and deal with it that way? Why do you have to invade? Why do you have to surveil our country? And that's how it should be. Like, there's nothing wrong with that. And I'm not a communist because I think that way. So let's talk about imperialism. Well, it's aggression by state A against the people of country B, followed by the subsequent coercive maintenance of such foreign rule. So when state A goes in, United States goes in, invades Iraq, and then they sort of rule it coercively in certain ways, either through troop presence or through pushing certain agenda law and stuff like that, or monies and foreign aid. Well, that's imperialism. And that's what we have today, and that's what we've had for decades. And it's wrong. That's what he's saying. We shouldn't be involved with that. So we can talk about in limiting government. And how do we do it? Well, in international affairs, we could pressure the government to confine its activities to the area it monopolizes and not attack others. So at a minimum, if we are going to have a military, that what we should do is limit it to us here in the United States and not other areas. And to remind ourselves, again, and we went over this before too in other parts, is that war is mass murder. We need to remind ourselves, tell us that we need to make that distinction, because it's not as easy to say, let's go and mass murder Iraq, people in Iraq. It's much easier to say, let's go to war. Let's intervene in Iraq. Let's assist them. But it's much more difficult if we were to say, let's mass murder them. A few people are going to support us, but they're the same things. They are, because that's what's going to happen. There's going to be casualties of war who are innocent. And if we do have the war, the scope of the assault upon innocents must be diminished. So the governments entering a war thereby become aggressors themselves against the innocent civilians. So that's the problem of intervening in other countries and going to war, is that, yeah, maybe in this world we could assume that somehow violence was initiated against us, and that's fine, okay? But once we go into that country and attack innocent civilians who don't support the system, who don't support the politicians, you know, like the 40-50% of people here in the United States who don't vote, or maybe who vote for a third party, because their opinions aren't being listened, so they're not necessarily consenting. We shouldn't kill them. We're going to aggress upon them, and that's no. And we talk about guerrilla war, but I talked about that in the previous part. So the libertarian view on foreign policy, and this is what Murray Rothbard writes, is that no one has the right to conscript, tax, or murder others, or to use violence against others in order to defend himself. That's basically what he's saying. Now that's interesting. I didn't really know what necessarily he's talking about that, because it seems a bit confusing, because you technically could use violence against others to defend yourself if aggression was initiated on you. So I'm assuming what he means is that because it's the state, and we talked about this, I think, in the last one with police agencies, if you had local police agencies, it would be the agency versus another agency. It wouldn't be a whole city, a whole state versus another state, or a whole country versus another country. It would be localized. So maybe that's what he was getting at, but it didn't really hit me. And so what he says is that foreign policy is the most important issue. And he says it for two reasons. But before I even talk about that, I'd say I've been thinking a lot about this stuff as I've been reading For a New Liberty, and I think the two most important issues, I'd agree that foreign policy is by far number one. And what's so great about foreign policy is that progressives and libertarians can both agree on it. Then my second one is the Federal Reserve, because of inflation and all that stuff, and just the booms and busts, the business cycle, the fractional reserve banking, all that stuff is a mess. It's horrible, and it sets up failure for everything. Those would be my most intuitive. I mean, of course, there's millions, and the state itself is an issue, right? But he said foreign policy is the most important issue, and this is the great Murray Rothbard, right? So he's even sidelining the state issue that I just talked about. And he's saying, why? Because of nuclear holocaust. So that was a time, too, of the people going underneath the desks and stuff. And it was a bit more serious then, but even now, there's thousands of nuclear warheads out there that governments control. And so that's why we need to limit this stuff, because that stuff could be used on us. And it can kill massive amounts of people, the mass murder of innocent people. And so that's why it's important to not have an expansion of foreign policy in other countries and war. And then the other reason is because war is the health of the state. War is the great excuse to enlarge, often permanently, the power of the state. Right? So they use war, politicians, the ruling class use war as a way to make the state bigger. We need to intervene here, we need more money. We need to build more planes. We need more troops. We need to be given this power that we'll only use in this thing. So we need the NSA. But we're only going to use it, the NSA and the CIA, we're only going to use it overseas. No. I mean, clearly we've seen the problems with that. And so what he asks is for the total withdrawal of weapons and military, and that's absolutely required. So the total withdrawal of all weapons and military from overseas, and that would be the libertarian view. And weapons would include nuclear arms, missiles, and bombers. I mean, he had a heavy focus on these things, these weapons, these means, I suppose, that we use to attack other countries that can cause mass destruction. Again, it's guerrilla warfare, like he discussed this in the other part, in part 5, is better because you can do it efficiently. You can just kill this guy, and you don't kill all these other people. Whereas with bombers, I mean, we're doing air attacks right now with Syria and Iraq. Well, that's going to kill innocent people. And there's going to be consequences for that. Serious consequences that we don't even talk about. And that's the libertarian view. So chapter 15, and this is a strategy for liberty. So this is what's required for the liberty movement to grow. So remind yourself before you hear a lot of this stuff, this was 1973. This is 40 years ago. And what's really important is you're going to hear a lot of things that are said today that were said then. And so I ask yourself to be honest with yourself and think, have things changed? And why haven't they changed? What do we need to change things and make it better? So education, right? We heard this with Ron Paul too recently, and we hear it all the time. That's why Liberty Me's set up. That's why our website's set up. Critical thinking is required. That's why there's numerous podcasts, numerous people. And the education, the goal is the persuasion and conversion of large numbers of people to the cause of liberty. That calls people's attention to the existence of such a system and converts people to the libertarian system. So we want to help people understand the state, how it's the main aggressor, how it violates the non-aggression principle, and what it does, and the consequence of what it does, and how it is not in our best interest, and how it intervenes and causes worse problems than what it would have been without the state. And we must convert the people to the libertarian system. So we have to try to say, okay, well, I can complain all I want about the state, but I got to tell you what we would do, what would be the solution, what we would do instead. And so the best way to do that is to educate others and yourself. That's the most important one, is you need to have education within yourself. You have to be able to understand why, what the non-aggression principle is, what it would mean. And it's one of the reasons I'm doing the blog right now, to work around, for me personally, understanding the nuances. Is voting an aggression of a violation of the non-aggression principle? Is spanking? Is parenting? And what's the conflict there? And how do we handle that? Like, those are the type of things that we need to have. And I'm sure many more that I don't even think about. And so I have a slide, the similarities today, where libertarians complain then. They complained then. He wrote about this. He said that it was an echo chamber, that libertarians were the echo chamber, that they spoke only to themselves, that few other people were listening. And this was in 73. And the same thing happens today. I mean, all you got to do is look on the podcasts and look at the views. I mean, Voluntary Virtues is a great program. Well, not all of them, but some of them. And you can look at the views on the YouTube videos. And you can see 30, 20. You can look at liberty.me, which is, people love Jeffrey Tucker for some reason. And even them, they have, 1,000, 500, 800, maybe 2,000. That's nobody. And this is worldwide, mind you. This isn't even in the United States like it was at that time, probably. And so, I don't mean to be completely negative, but it's magical. Like, you have to be able to see that and understand that and think, what are we doing wrong? If we're doing something wrong, I don't know. Maybe I don't know. I have no idea. So gradualism, that's something he talked about, and I've heard this being discussed in libertarian echo chambers. And it's the idea of basically taking baby steps to solve the problems of government, of fixing government. But the problem is that by concentrating on the immediate means, it may liquidate the ultimate goal. So if we do a change and say, we're going to get rid of Social Security, but we're going to do it this way. We have a step-by-step plan, a 10-point plan. Well, if it takes 10 years to do it, we might forget that our ultimate goal is to get rid of the program. And they might change it. And there's all these different problems. So principles are important. And what he says, Murray Rothbard says, is that libertarians must never advocate or prefer a gradual as opposed to immediate and rapid approach to his goal. So basically he wrote, and I've heard many articles about this today, is that if there was a button to end the state, would you push it? Now, I don't really get this because I guess my problem is with what he's going to continue to talk about. But what's the difference between, if I could push the button, yeah, I think most of us would push the button maybe. But what does that do? There's no button. So what's the point? That's not a pragmatic solution. And he's going to talk about that. So let's be realistic, right? So gradualism in theory is perpetuity in practice, right? It's going to, if you continue to do gradualism, you're going to take the state down bit by bit through laws or through repealing laws or whatever. Well, that means it's going to happen forever because the state's so big that it's going to take a while to do that. And so, and then this is where this whole section of this is so confusing to me, and I'm trying to wrap my head around all these concepts, because it's like you have a principle, but then you violate the principle, and I don't understand where the principle is here. And so, okay, this is an example of Murray Rothbard saying this is okay. This is an okay gradualism, or this is an okay abolition of the state. And it was a politician at the time in the 1830s who advanced the immediate emancipation of slaves. So he said we need to make them free and say they are free. And what you're doing is you're using the state to basically say that they are free. And you're not getting rid of the state. You're not doing anything else. So to me, that would be, and this is where it gets weird because I don't know if this is real, that it would be like the state, like you advocating the immediate freedom for homosexuals to get married to one another. Like, is that the same thing? Would that be okay to Murray Rothbard? Because you're still using the state. Isn't that gradualism, though? I mean, think about it. Isn't that gradualism? Because you haven't gotten rid of the apparatus of the state being in charge of marriage. So to me, that pushing the red button is that, well, if you're asked, that you would say that the state should repeal marriage, like should not even be involved, should not intervene with marriage, right? But you'd support legislation that would make it okay for them to get married, right? And then you're still sidelining people who want to get married to multiple people, or people who would want to get married to animals or some weird stuff like that, right? And so, I don't get, it's just a conflict to me. And to me, it's just, I'm okay with the conflict, but just don't complain about stuff. Just say generally that you'd support, what you should do is that if you're going to support legislation, that it should be limited, and it should try to follow the non-aggression principle as much as possible, because it's not perfect. And indeed it's not, because it's not applied perfectly. Because we all break the non-aggression principle, at least as a child, and definitely when we get older, or as we become parents, and etc. And so what he would say was not okay, so in a similar time frame, is that if you advocated an end to slavery, but only in 10 years' time. So this is, again, where it just kind of gets weird. But I suppose the difference is that, if you said 10 years, in contrast to 9 years or 8 years, that 10 years would be just too far down. It has to be now, right? Otherwise, it's immoral or something. I don't know what he didn't really say if it's immoral or not. But so then he questions, well, is libertarianism a utopia? Is it this perfect system? Because that's one of the things we hear about. And a utopian is one who advocates a system that is contrary to the natural law of human beings in the real world. So basically, it would not work even if everyone were persuaded to try to put it into practice. So even if we could support this idea of utopia, that it still wouldn't be able to work. And so what he says is that communism wouldn't work, and thus it's a utopia because it violates the nature of man, which comes down to the basic tendencies of individualism, in that we're all different. We all have unique abilities, we all have unique skills, and that's going to create divisions of labor. And when you have communism and you have people who are telling people what they should be doing, what they should, what rules and regulations that should be in their lives, that you're conflicting with that nature of man, and so you're going to have conflict. There's going to be no utopia, because the inherent being of man is to respect one's property and their, all that stuff that we talked about in part 1. And then he looks at the limited government idea, and I hear this all the time from libertarians and voluntarists, and I don't understand it. They say, oh, well, limited government failed, and that's why it's not going to work. And I continue to think that, if you think the founding fathers of this country were libertarians, you need to seriously go back and read some books and figure out, and I'm sure we'll cover these topics, of why they weren't libertarians and why they were more socialists, how I defined it in our definition section, more supportive of using government to intervene than to not. Okay? They weren't even asking, maybe there's 3 or 4 scenarios. There's a lot of stuff they were involved with. And they created a constitution that provided a means to involve government into everything. And so, copyright. That when you read that clause in there, that's not libertarian. At least I don't think it is. I'm sure there's a disagreement there. I mean, they even did slaves. They allowed slavery trade. And they allowed slaves to be owned. So not just the trade, but so they're not libertarians. And this problem to keep saying that limited government fails, well, there's no such thing. It's never happened. It's like saying communism failed, here or in Russia or something. It wasn't actually communism. Or that socialism has failed here. It's not really socialism. It's this mixed bag. Now, I'd agree that socialism would fail. Possibly. I don't know. Communism definitely would, for the reasons that he said. We just talked about individualism. But we haven't seen limited government. We haven't seen Ron Paul's out there. Now, Murray Rothbard and all you guys who think this stuff, you could go on about and say I'm dumb and all this stuff if Congress was full of Ron Pauls. If it was, 435 Ron Pauls in Congress, then fine. Yeah, I would take it. But we don't have that, so there's no limited government. That's silly. Now, whether it could happen, yeah, that's... But don't lie to me and tell me that it failed. Like, I don't like dishonesty. I like critical thinking, but not dishonesty. And so what he writes is that the more the desire for aggression disappears, the better any social system will work. Okay, so basically what we need to do, the goal of all this stuff, of social policy or government policy, and this is, again, where I get a little tricked in, is that, should we be voting? I brought this up on our blog recently, because it seems like the goal here and what he's trying to say is that, because that's really the only way you could do this, is through repealing laws, and only to do that is to have people you vote for who would do that. Otherwise, you're going to continue to get the same people who are socialists and who support government, right? So what should a libertarian support? Well, he has 2 criteria. Whatever the transitional demands, the ultimate end of liberty be always the desired goal. So that's, would you be willing to push the button? So check. I think most of us, if we're listening and we're still listening to this, you'd probably check. But you also have no steps or means ever explicitly or implicitly contradict the ultimate goal. So you can't advocate legislation or something that would explicitly or implicitly contradict that ultimate goal of liberty. So what he says is that it would be okay to advocate a push for a drastic reduction or the repeal of the income tax, but it's not okay to support any new tax or a tax increase. And so, for example, I would apply something today is like, let's say the fair tax. That was one of the things when I first heard about it about 10 years or 7 years ago, I was actually supportive of it. I'm not now. But the idea of it, when you think about it, and what Murray Rothbard would probably say is that it's not okay. Because yes, we're going to repeal all this other stuff, but you're advocating a completely brand new tax, a federal sales tax. I mean, that's huge. So what he would say is that, again, it seems to be he's supporting a candidate like Ron Paul, who would say no income tax. And no income tax, that's what he would say, none at all. But that even if someone said, well, let's just lower it, if the income tax is 35% to 10% or 5%, to me that would be drastic. Now, of course, you could have conflict there. Well, what's drastic? And again, you're still supporting the state because you're voting. And because you're using legislation and you're still taxing people. So that makes me think, again, that Murray Rothbard would support voting as long as you're doing it for a candidate you believe in that supports liberty. And so that basically any type of longer-term plan or scheme is not okay, even if it's only for 1 or 2 years. So it needs to be immediate. Although, except for the drastic reduction, I guess, I don't really get... the contradictions seem to be evident, and I didn't see any principled view on why those contradictions were okay, like an exception or something. So what should libertarians support? Well, the role of government should be to remove itself from all spheres of society just as rapidly as it can be pressured to do so. So here's another conflicting statement. This is a quote, right? that it should remove itself as rapidly as it can be pressured to do so. So it's applying some realism here, and it's saying, and when I think about this, I think of medical marijuana. Should you support legislation that imposes a new tax on marijuana and then now regulates it where it didn't before? Should you? I mean, I don't know. I would think not. But at the same time, it's now allowing it. It's making it, it's decriminalizing it, let's say, if it did that. I don't even know if it would do that. But because the public wouldn't really necessarily support, and that's where I'm getting here with that quote, is that the government, people generally aren't going to support just legalizing all drugs right away. So this is sort of this is really all that we can be pressured to do. Right? I don't know. And so is education enough? Well, Murray Rothbard says, everyone cannot be converted. It's impossible. The state creates an elite of rulers who dominate. So for once, to try to educate them and convert them is impossible. Because it's not in their incentive. I mean, is the president going to read a Murray Rothbard and then say, "Oh, I agree with that. Let's end all this stuff today"? No, that's not going to happen. So which groups? So these are the groups that Murray Rothbard looks at and says, these are the people we can intervene with, educate them, and maybe they convert them into libertarianism. And so he looks at campus youth. So today, you have Students for Liberty, remember? You have all these groups. It's the same thing. This is 40 years ago, happening today. And why? Because they're most open to reflection. You generally, younger people are more critical thinkers. Generally. And they should also be attracted to the libertarian positions closest to their concerns. So for them, it was the withdrawal from Cold War, civil liberties for everyone, and the legalization of drugs. I think I could be saying that today. Withdrawal from Iraq, Cold War with Russia now. Withdrawal from the war on terrorism. Let's put that in there. Civil liberties for everyone. We have Ferguson. We have all these situations that happen. And legalization of drugs. Okay. Still today. The media. We can influence the media. Now, I don't know if we could do that now, but I guess he thought then. And this is a quote. New social and political trends are most alert to the growing failures and breakdowns of establishment liberalism. I could swear that's Jeffrey Tucker saying that. It's breaking down. Minarchism is dead. Is it? It was 40 years ago. Oh, it's taken a long time to die. Crisis situation. So he does. What's the Rahm Emanuel? I guess who had that statement. If there's a danger, I don't know. Sean Hannity would always play on his show, right? And so Murray Rothbard says the same thing. Crisis situation. When there's a crisis situation, that's usually the easiest time for radical change to take place. And it's a breakdown of the existing system which calls forth a general search for alternative solutions. So imagine if, I guess a crisis situation could be Ferguson. I don't think it is, but let's say it was. Let's be the optimist here. Let's be Jeffrey Tucker. Let's put our Jeffrey Tucker hat on for a little bit and think really positively. If we thought that was a crisis situation and people thought minarchism was dead, that we don't need police anymore, and you're having a breakdown, there's going to have to be alternative solutions. And that's where libertarians come in, either as entrepreneurs and businessmen or through education and providing solutions. And so that's what we need to be prepared for. We need to be able to say, what would happen if there was no state? Well, there'd be something like the Pinkerton Agency. And guess what? They worked really damn well. Or look at all this stuff we have now that could be sufficient, that we don't have to pay billions of dollars, if not trillions of dollars, to take care of. So why liberty will win? So here's that positive argument again that I could swear I've heard from numerous leaders in the libertarian movement today, even Ron Paul, who I love and adore. And he says, Murray Rothbard says in quote, I am convinced that the dark night of tyranny is ending and that a new dawn of liberty is now at hand. Now, hey, I'm fine if that means that this dark night lasts for, 100 years and the new dawn lasts for 1,000. Then fine, yeah, maybe I'd agree with him. But again, you could say the same thing today. And then he wrote, many libertarians are pessimistic. They're just like me, I guess. There's a fallacy of impressionism. And that's what he writes. A superficial focus on the historical events themselves without a deeper analysis of the causal laws at work. So this is how he defends that. This is how he reacts. I'm pessimistic, I'm cynical, I'm pragmatic, whatever you want to call it. I'm thinking about it. And I say, oh, well, this happened 40, we've had this problem for hundreds of years, thousands of years, 10,000s of years. What are we going to do to change it? And what he says, his answer is that, well, what it is it's basically, it's the way we're looking at the historical events. We just need to stop looking at them. We're not understanding fully the causes of all this stuff. Well, I think we do, and the cause is that just people love the state, or that these people are too powerful that we can't, we can't do anything about it. Well, maybe I'm wrong. Now, he also says the wait might be very long indeed, in quotes. So I don't know how long. Maybe it's coming up soon. I have no idea. Maybe the internet will change things. Maybe 3D printers, which I think are going to be amazing. I think that's going to be revolutionary. If it's allowed, assuming it's allowed to be unregulated, which will be very interesting. So then he looked at the Industrial Revolution, and that was a great leap in history, and it's irreversible. It created a standard of living of the masses up from subsistence and rose to unheard of heights. So before then, people were poor, very deep in poverty, and after the Industrial Revolution, things just changed magically. And we're at a point now where we're okay with what we have, and that we're going to keep fighting. But I, again, look at it from a different perspective, and I look at it, well, the reason they have that, right? The Industrial Revolution occurred at the same time that government was socialist, right? Because government intervened in the economy. The first bank in the United States was created in its founding. Right? And in industrial, you can look at all this stuff that's happened since the 1800s. Look how great we are today. Well, it's not because of private anarchy or, private relationships. It's because of government. And that's the battle for me personally, is trying to understand that battle. How do you change people's hearts and minds when they think like that? Because it's reasonable to think like that. And so more similarities to today. He in quotes, but the long run is now here. Murray Rothbard, quote, the statist chickens have come home to roost. Quote, U.S. has now entered a permanent crisis situation. A permanent crisis situation where things are going to change. This was in 1973 to 75. They had high inflation, partial debt defaults by municipalities, high taxes, Social Security, regulations, education problems, drug problems. But we have those same problems today. We had those same problems a decade ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, and back to that time. He said Social Security is now bankrupt, in quotes. It's now bankrupt. How many times have you heard politicians say that today? It's bankrupt, but it's still going. That's not a crisis situation because nothing's changed. And, he puts in quotes, and it is safe to say that any further increases in taxes would be politically suicidal for politicians. What? He probably was the Jeffrey Tucker of the day, I guess. That's crazy. You know how many taxes have been added or increased since 1973? And how many will be continued to be increased? Look, in Florida, if this marijuana law passes, there's going to be another tax. We're okay with it. And so, yeah. Oh, the similarities to today. Let's keep going on all this positive message I'm providing to you. In case you haven't read it, or For a New Liberty, or haven't read it in a while. Another quote. The utter failure of American intervention in Vietnam. Oh, this is funny. The utter failure of American intervention in Vietnam has led to a growing re-examination of the entire interventionist foreign policy. How do you wrap your mind around that? This is somebody we look up to, which is one of the reasons you don't look up to people and you just treat them like everyone else and respect them, because we all say stupid stuff. I'm going to say it. You like this show, I can bet $1 million you're going to find something you do not like. And that's good. We should be working on our arguments. A re-examination because of Vietnam. How many wars and interventions have we had since then? I probably couldn't even that'd be fun, though, to make a list. That'd be a good blog entry. There'd probably be hundreds. And if you're talking about each specific intervention, there'd probably be millions, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands. And then he writes, the Watergate scandal has destroyed the public's faith in government. No longer will the president, and he writes this, no longer will the president be considered above the law. He said that's what happened. The public's faith towards government has decreased to below levels. And it has. Like, interestingly enough, in the 50s or 60s, it was like 70-80% of people who liked government, who had faith in government. And then it drastically went down after the Watergate scandal. And it's been around, 30, 40, 50%. No longer will the president be considered, but that doesn't matter. The public's faith in government doesn't matter if they can still do this stuff. And so on the YouTube, I have 3 pictures. I have Bush, I have Obama, and I have Nixon. Who's above the law? Are any of these 3 not above the law? I mean, did they do anything wrong? Did they violate laws? Any of these guys? Were they punished? Yeah, there's that public faith in government. It's been destroyed, right? And we're re-examining, right, in Syria. I hear it all the time, right? I'm listening to Diane Rehm. I'm listening to Left, Right, and Center podcast, which is great. Yeah, they're re-examining it. Yeah. No, I'm being completely sarcastic. So the themes of this part 6 and the final part: the private market is better than the government. Easily. I think we've shown time and time again in all these parts is that no matter what, in any situation, the private market is always going to be better than the government in handling a situation. Because of the price mechanism, because of competition, because of individualism, because of many things. Government monopoly is bad. That's the truth. You could argue if there was actual competition between governments, maybe it would be better, but it still wouldn't be the best, which the private market would provide. And that libertarians, if we are going to vote, if we are going to do these things, we should always be willing to push that red button. We should always support abolition. That should be always. We should have a sign in our office if we're elected. I would push the red button. And that education is key. We have to continue to inform others, and more importantly, we have to educate ourselves. We need to think critically. We need to not accept what Murray Rothbard writes or what Walter Block says or what I say. We need to think about it. I'm not. Yes, I did just compare myself to Murray Rothbard and Walter Block, and clearly I'm not either of those. But the point of it is that you need to think critically. You need to not just accept what people say or even what you say in your head. You need to think critically. You need to have endless curiosity to keep questioning yourself. Am I right? Am I right? Maybe I'm wrong. And the last theme is that history repeats itself. These problems that he had, that he lived with, that he tried to solve and provide solutions, it's happening today. And I could bet that if there was a Murray Rothbard in the 1800s, the same thing would be repeating. So thank you for listening to this. I hope you enjoyed this whole series. It was a blast to make, and I'm going to continue to make more of these because it is so much fun. Make sure you check out criticalthinkingIsRequired.com, and thank you for listening. And as always, think critically.